The summer air hung heavy over Detroit in 1969. On the outskirts of the city, the sound echoed through empty industrial streets long after midnight. It wasn't the scream of a small block winding to the moon. It was something deeper, slower, more intimidating. A low, violent roar that seemed to shake the pavement itself. Then came the unmistakable sound of 6 carburetor barrels opening all at once. The front end lifted, the rear tires disappeared into smoke, and within seconds, another Challenger had been left staring at taillights. Most people think the 426 HEMI was Chrysler's ultimate street engine. It was the legend, the poster child, the one everyone remembers. But what almost nobody realizes is that another Mopar big block quietly built an even more terrifying reputation where it mattered most on real American streets. It wasn't the expensive race-bred HEMI, it was the brutal, deceptively simple 446-pack. And what happened next changed everything. Because this wasn't just another muscle car engine. It became the nightmare of weekend street racers across America. It embarrassed cars that looked faster on paper. It produced mountains of torque that could twist drive shafts, destroy transmissions, and leave black stripes stretching for hundreds of feet. Yet just a few years later, it was gone. Production ended, the muscle car era collapsed, and one of Chrysler's greatest engines faded into legend almost overnight. So how did the 446-pack become one of the most feared street engines America ever built? And why did something so dominant disappear almost as quickly as it arrived? To answer that, you have to go back to a time when horsepower wasn't just a number, it was a weapon. By the late 1960s, Detroit had become the center of an all-out horsepower war. Every major manufacturer wanted bragging rights. Chevrolet had unleashed the 427 and was preparing monsters like the 454 LS6. Ford answered with the 428 Cobra Jet, and later the mighty 429 Cobra Jet. Pontiac had the Ram Air 4. Oldsmobile had the 455. Buick brought the Stage 1. Every weekend, dealerships became battlegrounds, and every stoplight felt like the starting line at a drag strip. Chrysler already had the legendary 426 Street HEMI. Officially rated at 425 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque, it was arguably the most exotic American V8 money could buy. It featured massive hemispherical combustion chambers, cross-flow cylinder heads, huge valves measuring 2.25 inches on the intake side and 1.94 inches on the exhaust, and a compression ratio of 10.25 to 1. It could easily produce well over 500 horsepower with basic tuning. But there was a problem. The HEMI was expensive, very expensive. The complex cylinder heads required extensive machining, assembly costs were high, insurance companies had already begun recognizing the HEMI badge as a warning sign. Buyers paid a hefty premium just to own one, and many simply couldn't justify the extra cost. Dealers loved displaying HEMI cars in the showroom, but they weren't exactly flying off the lot. Chrysler needed something different, something cheaper, something easier to manufacture, and something that could still humiliate almost everything else on the road. Engineers turned toward an engine they already knew exceptionally well, the RB Series 440. Introduced for the 1966 model year, the 440 wasn't flashy. It didn't have hemispherical heads or race-inspired marketing, but underneath, it was an engineering masterpiece for one simple reason: displacement. At 440 cubic inches, or 7.2 liters, it dwarfed most competitors. Its massive 4.32-inch bore, combined with a relatively short 3.75-inch stroke, created an engine that breathed effortlessly while still delivering enormous torque. The wedge-style combustion chambers were simpler than the HEMI's design, making production faster and significantly less expensive. With a cast-iron block, forged steel crankshaft on high-performance versions, hydraulic camshaft, and rugged bottom end, the 440 earned a reputation for durability long before anyone imagined adding something far more aggressive on top. Most people don't realize how overbuilt this engine already was. The large main bearing journals gave the crankshaft impressive stability under heavy loads. Thick cylinder walls tolerated repeated high RPM abuse. cooling passages kept temperatures surprisingly consistent despite the engine's enormous displacement. It wasn't an exotic race engine, it was a workhorse, which made it the perfect foundation for something much more dangerous. By 1968, Chrysler's performance division was watching another trend unfold. Racers weren't just chasing horsepower anymore, they wanted instant acceleration. They wanted engines that hit like a freight train the moment the light turned green. Torque was becoming king. The standard high-performance 440 already produced around 375 horsepower and an incredible 480 pound-feet of torque. On the street, those numbers translated into effortless acceleration. While smaller high-revving engines needed to be wound out, the 440 simply shoved the car forward with overwhelming force from low RPM. Engineers realized they didn't necessarily need another HEMI. They needed a smarter 440. And then, someone proposed an idea that sounded almost ridiculous. Instead of installing one large 4-barrel carburetor, why not use 3? It wasn't entirely new. Pontiac had experimented with tri-power setups years earlier, and Chevrolet had offered its famous triple 2-barrel arrangement on select models. But Chrysler's engineers believed they could refine the concept specifically for the massive 440. The system they developed became known as the six-pack. 3 Holley 2-barrel carburetors sat proudly atop an Edelbrock-designed aluminum intake manifold. The center carburetor handled normal driving duties, providing smooth throttle response and decent fuel economy during everyday cruising. The 2 outer carburetors remained closed until the driver buried the accelerator. Then everything changed. As throttle linkage progressively opened the outboard carbs, 6 Venturas suddenly began feeding the giant V8. Air rushed into the engine, fuel delivery increased dramatically, the intake roar transformed from a deep rumble into a violent mechanical bellow that every Mopar enthusiast still recognizes today. Officially, Chrysler rated the new 446-pack at 390 horsepower at 4,700 revolutions per minute and an astonishing 490 pound-feet of torque at only 3,200 revolutions per minute. But almost nobody believed those numbers. Even back then, enthusiasts suspected Chrysler was intentionally understating the engine's output to keep insurance companies from raising premiums even further. Independent dyno tests and modern engine builders have repeatedly demonstrated that a properly tuned factory 6-pack could produce well over 420 horsepower at the crank, with some estimates approaching 430 horsepower in ideal conditions. And unlike the peaky HEMI, nearly all of that torque arrived frighteningly early. That meant one thing: street races were about to become very interesting. The first true showcase for the engine arrived in the middle of 1969 with Chrysler's now famous A12 performance package. Available on the Plymouth Road Runner and Dodge Super Bee, the package wasn't designed to impress country club buyers. It was built for one purpose: winning. Fiberglass liftoff hoods saved weight, black steel wheels replaced flashy hubcaps, heavy-duty suspension components improved traction, a Dana 60 rear axle handled brutal launches, while buyers could choose either the rugged A833 4-speed manual transmission or Chrysler's proven torque flight automatic, famous for surviving punishment that destroyed many competitors' gearboxes. Everything about the package screamed function over style. No unnecessary chrome, no luxury, just raw performance. And when the first A12 cars reached customers, word spread almost immediately. These things were unbelievably fast. But nobody, not even Chrysler's own engineers, could predict what would happen once ordinary drivers began lining them up against the biggest names in American muscle, because the numbers printed in the brochures were only half the story. The truth was waiting at the next stoplight. By the time the first 446-pack cars had a few thousand miles on them, something unusual started happening across America. At local drive-ins, industrial parks after dark, and deserted stretches of highway, racers began whispering about a Plymouth Road Runner with a flat black hood that nobody could beat. It didn't matter if the challenger drove a Chevrolet Chevelle SS 396, a Pontiac GTO Ram Air 3, or even Ford's new 428 Cobra Jet. On paper, many of those cars looked evenly matched. Some even claimed more horsepower. But once the light turned green, the story often ended the same way. The Mopar simply walked away. Most people don't realize why. It wasn't because the 446-pack made dramatically more horsepower than everything else. It was because of where it made its power. While many rival engines came alive high in the rev range, Chrysler's giant RB Big Block delivered nearly its full 490 pound-feet of torque just above idle. That meant brutal acceleration without needing to scream the engine to 6,500 revolutions per minute. Push the throttle halfway, and the center Holley handled the load with surprising smoothness. Push it all the way, and the two outboard carburetors snapped open. Drivers often described it as getting hit from behind by a freight train. The engine's personality changed instantly. The induction roar filled the cabin, the rear tires fought desperately for grip, and the hood seemed to rise toward the windshield as all 440 cubic inches came alive. Even experienced drivers admitted the sudden surge could catch them off guard. One Road Runner owner later joked, "You didn't drive a six-pack. You held on and hoped the rear tires agreed with your plans. But there was a problem. All that torque exposed weaknesses everywhere else. The engine wasn't usually the first thing to fail. Everything attached to it was. Factory clutch assemblies wore out quickly after repeated hard launches. Universal joints twisted under shock loads, drive shafts occasionally bent, axle shafts snapped when drivers dumped the clutch on sticky tires. Even Chrysler's rugged A833 4-speed sometimes suffered broken synchronizers after countless street races. Mechanics began noticing another pattern. Cars came into the shop with perfectly healthy engines and completely destroyed rear ends. That's what 490 pound-feet of torque could do in 1969. Quarter-mile testing confirmed what racers were already seeing. A properly driven 1969 Plymouth Road Runner A12 equipped with the 446-pack consistently ran the quarter mile in around 13.5 seconds at approximately 105 miles per hour on factory tires. Under ideal conditions, experienced drivers managed low 13-second passes, and with little more than better tires, careful tuning, and open exhaust, many owners dipped into the high 12-second range. Those numbers might not sound shocking today. Back then, they were enough to embarrass some of the quickest production cars in America. And unlike many high-strung performance engines, the six-pack did it with remarkable consistency. That wasn't an accident. The engineering behind the induction system was surprisingly clever. Instead of opening all three carburetors at once, Chrysler engineers designed progressive linkage. The center Holley supplied fuel during normal driving, keeping throttle response predictable and fuel consumption relatively reasonable for a 7.2-liter V8. Only when the throttle reached roughly two-thirds travel did the vacuum-operated outboard carburetors begin opening. The result was the best of both worlds, smooth around town, savage at full throttle. But engineering a system like that wasn't easy. Synchronizing three carburetors required careful adjustment. If one carburetor opened too early, the engine stumbled, too late, and performance suffered. Incorrect float levels caused hesitation. Vacuum diaphragm leaks prevented the outer carbs from opening completely. Owners who didn't understand the system often complained the engine felt sluggish. Experienced Mopar tuners knew better. "The carbs aren't broken," one Chrysler technician reportedly told frustrated customers. "They're just smarter than you think." Properly adjusted, the six-pack became one of the most responsive induction systems Detroit had ever installed on a production muscle car. Although the 426 HEMI remained Chrysler's ultimate factory race engine, the 446-pack earned enormous respect in superstock and stock eliminator competition. Weekend racers discovered the wedge-head design responded exceptionally well to simple modifications: a slightly larger camshaft, headers, minor ignition tuning, careful carburetor calibration. Suddenly, the factory-rated 390 horsepower looked laughably conservative. Dyno sessions routinely showed outputs exceeding 450 horsepower with relatively modest upgrades, while fully prepared naturally aspirated race engines pushed well beyond 500 horsepower without sacrificing reliability. That's because the RB block itself was incredibly robust. Its generous bore spacing allowed excellent airflow through modified cylinder heads. Thick cylinder walls handled repeated rebuilds. The forged crankshaft used in many performance applications tolerated sustained high RPM far better than most enthusiasts expected. It wasn't exotic engineering, it was honest engineering. Simple, strong, reliable, exactly what racers wanted. One drag racer reportedly summed it up perfectly. The HEMI got the magazine covers. The 440 got us home. That reputation spread fast. Even drivers loyal to Ford and Chevrolet quietly admitted the six-pack deserved respect. Street racers learned one simple rule. If a Black Hood Road Runner or Super B rolled up beside you wearing 440 plus 6 callouts, you'd better have something special under your own hood. Otherwise, you were probably racing for second place. But success created new problems. Insurance companies had been watching. Throughout the late 1960s, accident claims involving high-performance muscle cars skyrocketed. Young drivers were buying increasingly powerful machines, street racing became more common, and insurers responded the only way they knew how. Premiums exploded. Some drivers under 25 discovered annual insurance costs approaching the price of another used car. Dealers watched potential customers walk away simply because they couldn't afford coverage. Government regulators were watching too. Public concern over emissions continued growing. Federal standards became stricter almost every year. High-compression engines, aggressive camshafts, and rich carburetor calibrations suddenly faced a future they weren't designed for. The very characteristics that made the six-pack legendary were becoming liabilities. By 1970, the muscle car war had reached its absolute peak. Horsepower numbers were climbing, quarter-mile times were falling. Every manufacturer wanted one final knockout punch before the decade changed forever. For Chrysler, the 446-pack had become exactly what its engineers hoped it would be. It wasn't just another option in the brochure. It was a street legend. Buyers could order it in the Plymouth Road Runner, Dodge Super B, Dodge Challenger R/T, and Plymouth Cuda. Then came the changes that ended everything. The first blow didn't come from Chevrolet or Ford. It came from Washington. The newly strengthened federal emissions regulations began forcing manufacturers to rethink engine design. High compression ratios suddenly became a problem. Aggressive ignition timing increased emissions. Rich carburetor mixtures no longer met tightening standards. Then fuel itself changed. As low-lead and eventually unleaded gasoline became the future, the six-pack's 10.5 1 compression ratio became increasingly difficult to support. Without high-octane fuel, detonation became a serious concern. Engineers could lower compression, but doing so meant sacrificing the very performance that made the engine legendary. There wasn't an easy solution, and then the fuel crisis made things even worse. Although the major oil embargo arrived in 1973, buyers had already begun paying closer attention to fuel economy. A hard-driven 446-pack could easily return single-digit miles per gallon. During the golden age of cheap gasoline, few people cared. Now they did. Insurance companies delivered another crushing blow. Throughout the early 1970s, premiums for high-performance muscle cars skyrocketed. Young buyers, the very customers who dreamed of owning Road Runners, Challengers, and Super Bs, often found the annual insurance bill almost impossible to afford. Sales slowed dramatically. There was another issue hiding beneath the surface. The six-pack itself required careful maintenance. Those three Holley two-barrel carburetors delivered incredible performance when perfectly synchronized, but they demanded regular adjustment. Vacuum diaphragms aged, linkages wore. Mechanics unfamiliar with the system sometimes misdiagnosed problems, leaving owners frustrated. For Chrysler, continuing the six-pack simply became harder every year. Production quietly came to an end after the 1971 model year. Just like that, one of America's greatest street engines disappeared from new car showrooms. Not because it had become slow, not because it had become unreliable, but because the world around it had changed. The muscle car era that had exploded only a few years earlier was collapsing with astonishing speed. Compression ratios dropped across the industry. Horsepower ratings fell dramatically as manufacturers switched from gross horsepower measurements to the more realistic SAE net ratings. By the mid-1970s, the horsepower war was over. For many enthusiasts, it felt like the end of an era. But legends have a funny way of refusing to die. As the decades passed, collectors began realizing just how special the original six-pack cars really were. The 1969 A12 Road Runner and Super B became some of the most sought-after Mopars ever built. Original numbers-matching examples started commanding six-figure prices at major collector auctions. Rare, well-documented cars have since sold for well over $150,000, with exceptional restorations bringing even more. Engine builders never forgot the 440 either. Modern aftermarket aluminum cylinder heads, hydraulic roller camshafts, forged rotating assemblies, and improved ignition systems have transformed the old RB platform into an even bigger monster. Today, it's common to see naturally aspirated 440-based builds producing 550 to 650 reliable horsepower, while retaining the street manners Chrysler engineers could only dream about in 19. Push the displacement to 500 cubic inches or more with aftermarket stroker kits, and 700 pound-feet of torque becomes entirely achievable. Yet despite all the modern technology, enthusiasts still chase the same experience: 3 carburetors, a giant cast iron big block, and that unforgettable sound when all 6 barrels open at once. It's a sound that instantly transports Mopar fans back to an era when stoplights became starting lines and horsepower solved almost every problem. So why does the 446-pack still matter more than 50 years later? Because it represents something larger than an engine. It represents the moment when Detroit perfected the formula for affordable American performance. Chrysler proved you didn't need exotic hemispherical cylinder heads or race-only engineering to build a car that terrified the competition. Sometimes, all you needed was a massive wedge-head V8, an ingenious 3-carburetor setup, and enough torque to leave 2 black stripes stretching down the road. The 446-pack didn't disappear because it stopped winning. It disappeared because the rules changed. Emissions regulations tightened. Insurance costs exploded. Fuel prices climbed. The muscle car era ended long before enthusiasts were ready to let it go. But the legend never faded. Even today, when a restored 6-pack Road Runner or Challenger fires to life, people stop what they're doing. They know they're hearing one of the greatest big block engines Chrysler ever built. An engine that earned its reputation not through advertising, but by proving itself one street race, one drag strip, and one smoky burnout at a time. And that's why the 446-pack remains one of the most respected engines in American automotive history. It didn't just dominate the streets, it defined an entire generation of muscle cars before disappearing into legend.